dramatic move. French President Emmanuel Macron has dissolved the French Parliament.
Resounding defeat in Sunday's EU elections against the far right.
Rising star of French politics, 28-year-old Jordan Bardella. How is this young man so upending French politics?
Jordan Bardella is young, popular and described as far-right. He leads the National Rally Party along with his mentor, Marine Le Pen. He's just scored a massive victory in the European elections, shocking President Emmanuel Macron, who immediately called a snap election. The first round of the vote is on June the 30th, which means that 28-year-old Bardella could become Prime Minister within weeks.
Jordan Bardella knows how to attract support. In one French poll of the country's 50 most popular public figures, he was the only politician to make the list. The 28-year-old president of National Rally is often pictured taking selfies with adoring supporters. Just more content to feed his audience on TikTok, where he has over 1.5 million followers. Bardella is often described as charismatic, impeccably dressed, and mild-mannered. But his policies are anything but. He's strongly anti-immigration and anti-Islam, both of which he blames for the rising crime in France. And he's anti-European Union. He claims France is disappearing. President Macron is worried about National Rally's Bardella-inspired breakthrough at the European elections. The party secured 31.5% of the vote, twice as many as Macron's centrist alliance. In response, the president dissolved France's parliament and called fresh elections in late June.
Après avoir procédé aux consultations prévues à l'article 12 de notre Constitution, j'ai décidé de vous redonner le choix de notre avenir parlementaire par le vote.
An attempt to either get the public to stop the far right in its tracks, or even give the far right a chance at domestic power and hope they mess it up. It's a dangerous strategy. French newspaper Le Monde depicted Bardella as a Pied Piper figure, leading off young voters. Polls show 32% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted for him in the European election. His background is seen as part of his popularity. He's from an immigrant Italian family and grew up in a poor working-class suburb in the northeast of Paris, brought up alone by his divorced mother. Critics, however, point out that his story of hardship and poverty doesn't add up. His father ran a vending machine business and was able to pay for Bardella to go to a private school, for example. And his rise seems anything but organic. He joined the National Front at 16, later dropping out of the elite Sorbonne University to concentrate on politics. It was at this point he was apparently spotted by far-right matriarch and National Front leader Marine Le Pen as a star of the future. The party then purposely shaped him into the polished political operative he is today, and in 2022 made him the leader of the renamed National Rally.
Si vous avez la majorité à l'Assemblée nationale, qui sera Premier ministre? Jordan Bardella ou vous-même Marine Le Pen?
Jordan Bardella.
Le Pen calls him her lion cub and has made him her candidate for Prime Minister in the upcoming snap election. Some speculate that Le Pen's lion is so popular he could well usurp her and claim the presidency. So, is he charismatic enough to finally propel the far right into power in France? It's not impossible that he could be France's Prime Minister in just a matter of weeks.
Interesting times in France. Let's bring in our guest now. And today we have Paul Smith, who is a professor of French history, Nabila Ramdani, the author of Fixing France, and finally Philippe Marliere, a professor of French politics. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Paul, if I could start with you. That's the prospect we have. In a few weeks' time, France getting its first ever far-right Prime Minister.
Yes, that's the possibility. Macron has called this snap election, and Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Rassemblement National Party, has made it clear that she would not be a candidate to be prime minister, but she's putting forward her protege, a young 28-year-old called Jordan Bardella. So that's the prospect we have if they become the largest group in the National Assembly on the 7th of July.
And what do you think are his chances?
Well, I think it's quite possible at the moment. The Front National would have to get north of 200 seats. They shocked and surprised us in 2022 by getting 89 seats for a kickoff, but things have changed very much over the last couple of years. And of course, they have the wind in their sails after Sunday's European election results. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the Rassemblement National will be the largest single group in the National Assembly, even if they don't have an absolute majority of 289 seats.
And then constitutionally, Macron is obliged to appoint him Prime Minister?
Not necessarily. Macron, as president, has the freedom to choose whoever he thinks can actually lead. And it may well be, there's been some talk about the idea of a technocratic prime minister being appointed to lead some sort of coalition. And it would depend on Bardella's capacity also to bring in other parties if he didn't have an absolute majority. So there is still very much up in the air. It really depends on how the numbers fall on the night of the 7th of July.
And Nabila, what are your predictions?
Well, I think, this theatre of the absurd style, decision by Macron to call a snap election could indeed have multiple consequences, including having a far-right prime minister, not least of all, because now we're seeing, the National Rally, the far-right in France, trying to form an alliance with the Gaullist conservatives. But we also have a front, a national popular front already being formulated by the left, and there are millions who are prepared to join it so as to keep the far right out of the power. And we're clearly seeing a polarization in France, which in fact is an echo of the 1950s across Europe. And the only certainty appears to be that Macron's own liberal coalition will be in deep trouble. I think that what we will have once these snap elections are over is a lot more chaos. We'll see nobody emerging with a clear majority in the French Parliament, and we'll have a very divided France. And what we might clearly see is an anti-Macron sentiment, an anti-Macron vote becoming against the incumbent president, who is always unpopular, particularly at this advanced stage of his presidency. And he only has 3 years left in office.
And Philippe, your predictions?
Well, it will very much depend on the results, the Rassemblement National's results, that is. If they get an absolute majority, the threshold in the National Assembly is 280 seats, then Macron will have no choice but to ask Jordan Bardella to appoint Bardella as Prime Minister, and he will form a government, which will be probably a kind of far-right government with some additions coming from Republicans, the main conservative party, which is splitting over the issue now. If now the party comes first, top, if you like, on top of all the other parties in the National Assembly with important gains, which it is expected anyway, then of course the game is more open. As Paul said, Macron might try then to form a kind of coalition government which will bypass the Rassemblement National. But of course that won't be easy to do, because imagine if the far right wins the election, even if it doesn't get an absolute majority, it would be a kind of not very democratic thing to do, to say, well, the French put the far right ahead, but then we're going to ignore what they just did. So it's a very complex situation. One thing is for sure, an absolute majority for the far right, then the far right will govern France.
Okay, and Paul, if he becomes France's next prime minister, how does France change?
Well, it changes fundamentally. I mean, some people are casting him as being a sort of a Mark II of Le Pen, which up to a point he is, but there are also some really significant differences. He's much more of an identitarian politician. He's much more committed to the idea of things like the Great Replacement. And I think that it's also going to cause a lot of anxiety. It already is causing a great deal of anxiety in France, the possibility of not just the Rassemblement National having a majority, but him as prime minister. And I think that it's going to get very uncomfortable indeed for some groups. Even French nationals living in this country are beginning to feel a little bit anxious about how they're going to be treated by a National Rally government.
Nabila, how do you think France will change as a result of Bardella becoming prime minister, if indeed it does?
Well, I would caveat that very cautiously, actually. I think Macron is taking a typical Macron gamble, dare I say. On the one hand, he hoped that it would focus voters on the crisis that the far right poses to France. But on the other hand, he knows that he's very unpopular right now, and he might get badly defeated. There's a precedent. There are a few precedents actually, but the latest one is President Jacques Chirac, who tried calling a snap election. He actually called one in 1997, and he failed miserably because he let a socialist government in after hoping to build up support for his conservative economic policies. But all that said, I think Macron seems to be very happy governing by decree, and he might just be happy carrying on doing that. Whoever gets in, France is overwhelmed.
Paul mentioned that life may get uncomfortable for some groups in French society. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with that, because I think even though Bardella in particular seems to appeal to young voters, not least of all because he's young himself, a senior politician. He's only 28. He's also clean cut. He's in a kind of boy next door kind of way. And some might say he also have matinee idol good looks. He also appeals to a lot of people using social media platforms such as TikToks, which are very popular amongst young people. All that said, I think he's also very traditional. He has a very traditional 1950s look about him, which I think appeals to traditional right-wing conservatives. He with his short back and sides haircut, his lack of facial hair, his suit and tie. He looks like he's about to join the army, to be honest. And I think his blunt speaking and extremely insensitive approach towards ethnic and religious minorities doesn't suggest that he's the new face of a multicultural Europe, as some headlines would have you to believe. I think he's, in fact, represents an old world where old-style nationalism is fading, frankly.
I suppose, Philippe, you'd explain that by the fact that he was handpicked by Marine Le Pen and politically groomed by her over the last decade or so. What has been her impact on him, her protege?
It's a very important point, because before discussing what Prime Minister Bardella would do heading the government, I think it's important to remember that it's a partnership. It's a Le Pen-Bardella partnership. And it's Marine Le Pen who who literally constructed the sort of the political persona of Bardella. He's 28 only. He's totally untested. He's been elected twice MEP, that's all. And I think it showed pretty much during the televised debates in the run-up to this European election, when challenged and pushed a little bit harder by some journalists or his political opponent, then he was not particularly good. He didn't seem to master his political brief, his economic dossier, and that was seen by his opponent as like, well, look, he's not really fit to govern. It seems that for his electorate that doesn't matter, because they still supported him. The main political decision will be made by Le Pen, and I don't see Bardella being a kind of free agent. And even if he becomes prime minister, I think it will remain a partnership.
So, Paul, not the master of his brief during that debate, but the master of appealing to young people via TikTok.
Les amis, je fais cette vidéo avant le vote de dimanche pour vous lancer un ultime appel. Allez voter.
Of the entire election result, 31.5% of the vote, around about a third of 18 to 24-year-olds voted for him, which was double what he achieved in the previous election. Now, usually young people tend to go to the left, towards the Greens and so on, but somehow he pulled them over. How did he do that?
Well, I think it is precisely that. It's using social media, but we're seeing right across Europe, not just in France, a really significant shift in a lot of our received ideas about who votes which way at certain ages. Those kind of ideas, and in what regions, for example, are kind of going out the window. We saw that with who was voting for the Rassemblement National where as well on Sunday. So his appeal is one to being a young person. Okay, well that works up to a certain degree, precisely as Nabila said. But I think that also he uses social media in a way that more traditional politicians haven't really got a handle on, and that's what's bringing people over to the Rassemblement National, the National Rally. And so that's the kind of energetic appeal that he has, even if there's not very much behind it. It doesn't take very much nowadays to win over a number of voters. You don't have to be very deep to do that.
The National Rally are famous for, let's say, wanting strict controls on immigration, of course, illegal immigration, but also quite anti-EU. They don't want to cede more power to the European Union. Do you think it is the fact that younger people are coming towards that opinion in France that's actually helped him here? Nabila?
Well, I think as Paul quite rightly said, Bardella is by no means a sophisticated political player. And if anything, people are very much aware that they're voting for Marine Le Pen and indeed her views of the world through that token young man who still has plenty to learn about the real world. And if anything, I think his main popularity base comes from very traditional old people who see him as the kind of Frenchman that dominated France when they were young. And he represents nostalgia and certainly not a dynamic future. And that's exactly what the National Front is all about. It's a reactionary party. It's a very much a provincial-minded party, which effectively wants to keep France as it was. They want to keep French produce, they want to keep driving French cars, and they resent the kind of modern world and big issues such as globalization, or indeed they're very worried about the environment and more close to home issues such as the cost of living and indeed housing. And all that fear is cleverly and effectively channeled by extremist parties, populist parties such as the far-right National Rally.
Philippe, are there any legitimate concerns that Bardella raises when he says he's concerned about illegal immigration, or just, in fact, the rise in legal immigration and the rise in crime and so on? Does he bring up any legitimate points?
I think it's perfectly entitled in any society to discuss immigration and law and order related issues. I think we all do it, whatever the country. What probably marks Bardella and his party as far right, i.e. to the right of what is the mainstream of politics, is that when he discusses those issues, he tends to distinguish between different categories of citizens, of French people. There are, those who are deep down French, and others who may have a French passport, but indeed they are probably less French due to cultural differences, due to the fact they do not totally, according to him, conform to the French culture and its values. That's very much how I would frame the debate. And on that, it typically is the continuation of the old National Front of Jean-Marie Le Pen. Le Pen used to do that, always sort of targeting and pointing the finger at some categories of French people who are French by law, mostly ethnic minorities, if you like. Today, Islam and Muslims would be the issue. And on that, this is really the continuation, and why I think a lot of observers and political scientists in France keep calling and branding this party far right.
And tipping this forward to the presidential election in 2027, Paul, does his victory, his performance in the European elections, take Marine Le Pen closer to the presidency?
Well, the presidency is a very different kind of election, of course, and it's all about, we all vote for who we want to vote for in the first round. In the second, most of us vote against the person we don't want. And we saw that in 2017 and we saw that in 2022. I mean, there are some people who say, and I would subscribe to the view up to a certain point, that the risk Macron is taking is okay, a far right-wing government, but he's prepared to, in some senses, take that risk because they would be shown to be incompetent, and that would undermine Le Pen's bid in 2027. That's one argument. I'm not completely convinced that would play out that way, but that's certainly one of the interpretations that's been made. So, and one of the reasons, of course, that Le Pen wouldn't want to stand herself, she almost immediately the dissolution was announced, she announces that Bardella would be our candidate for prime minister. He's not actually standing in the election, but he would be our candidate for prime minister, not me, because the received wisdom again in France is that you can't win the presidency from the Matignon, the residence of the prime minister. So that would be the kind of the testing ground, if you like. And so there's one interpretation is that the test that the Rassemblement National would face between now and 2027 would actually see the wheels come off, but it would also give the opportunity for an alternative candidate to emerge, whether that's on the left or in the centre, against Le Pen.
Okay, let's take a look at how the hard right and far right have done in other countries around Europe in Sunday's election. And we have Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy. They've gone from 5 seats to 24 seats. Austria's Freedom Party has doubled its number of seats to 6. And the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, has gone from 11 to 15 seats, thanks partly, again, to how its candidates use TikTok. Let's have a listen to Max Krah trying to be like Andrew Tate.
Jeder dritte junge Mann hatte noch nie eine Freundin. Du gehörst dazu, schau keine Pornos. Wähl nicht die Grünen. Geh raus an die frische Luft. Steh zu dir. Sei selbstbewusst. Guck geradeaus. Und vor allem, lass dir nicht einreden, dass du lieb, soft, schwach und links zu sein hast. Echte Männer sind rechts. Echte Männer haben Ideale. Echte Männer sind Patrioten. Dann klappt's auch mit der Freundin.
So, Paul, that was Max Krah there. The AfD, his party, subsequently dumped him after he said not all the SS were criminals. But still, what does the rise of the right, if you like, across Europe tell you about the population in Europe? Are they looking for alternatives now?
I think there's a lot of frustration, isn't there? The far right-wing parties do well because they haven't been tried. I mean, one of the factors that we see in France, increasingly amongst people who once upon a time would never have thought of voting for the far right, is that, and one of the things that the far right has never done, it's never been in government. So, for years and years, the far right in France would say that everybody else was rotten, tous pourris, everybody else is corrupt, and we haven't been tried. And there's a lot of exasperation, a lot of frustration, not just in France, but right across Europe. And so that lack of experience of having been governed by the far right, unlike in Great Britain, where the opposite appears to be happening in the forthcoming general election, you've got this kind of appeal of the far right, and I think that's where they're getting their traction. Not exclusively, but that's a part of their appeal, is that they've not been tried out. I mean, historically they have, but historical memory is not very good.
No. Philippe, Marine Le Pen actually broke with the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, and reached out to Giorgia Meloni now, who seems to be an example of how you campaign on far-right platform, and then you pivot towards the centre, which has actually disappointed a lot of Italians who voted for her. Do you think Marine Le Pen is going to be successful in repositioning herself in the same way?
I expect her to do what Meloni has been doing in government. If, of course, the far right in France runs the country, I expect her to do that in EU international affairs. She will probably have to certainly adjust to what the European scene is. France is a major partner and actor in there. So, of course, she can't really antagonize her partners. That would make her life, personal life, much more difficult then. I think that probably internally, in terms of domestic politics, I think we'll see a more conservative right-wing agenda, certainly on immigration, they've been following for decades now a policy which is anti-constitutional according to French law, which is called a national preference. National preference it's about discrimination. It's about allocating social subsidies to French people. It's about giving places in schools and nurseries to French nationals only at the expense of foreigners, which is, again, illegal in the French context. I expect them to try to change the law and pursue such a discriminatory policy. So on the one hand, a kind of quite amicable face abroad, and internally, like Meloni, pursuing very right-wing policies at home.
Philippe, Marliere, Nabila Ramdani and Paul Smith, thank you all very much for your contributions to Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus, TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.